This is a moment.
It's irrational what he's doing, and you know it.
Well, it's not irrational to stand up to the Iranians.
It's irrational to be posting.
It's not irrational, but we're in a moment.
Pictures of himself.
We're in a moment.
Far-right MAGA figure Scott Jennings was back on Abby Phillip's show, doing exactly what he does every single night, playing the same role, acting with that familiar smug attitude, pushing misinformation and disinformation, and going out of his way to defend the indefensible. This time, he's defending Donald Trump after posting an AI-generated image of himself as Jesus Christ. We're going to break down clips from this heated panel on Abby Phillip's show, and I'll be sharing my thoughts along the way. Let's get into it together.
Suddenly, Republicans don't want religion in politics. President Trump's war of words with the Pope is again escalating, but this time it's his allies that are doing the talking. For days, President Trump has criticized the Pope for speaking out against the Iran war, which has received bipartisan backlash. And then, of course, he added fuel to the fire when he posted a picture depicting himself as Jesus. He posted another picture today, but this time he is alongside AI Jesus. The Pope continues to advocate for peace, even doing so again tonight, while Republican officials are lecturing him on all things theology and doctrine.
Now, we can, of course, have disagreements about whether this or that conflict is just, but I think that it's important, in the same way that it's important for the Vice President of the United States to be careful when I talk about matters of public policy, I think it's very, very important for the Pope to be careful when he talks about matters of theology. Well, you've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth.
The Pope needs to keep his business into leading his flock, so to speak, leading the church, and probably stay out of the political arena. He doesn't need to be getting involved in the political arena. Go lead your church. I didn't elect the Pope to be president.
A pontiff or any religious leader can say anything they want, but obviously if you wade into political waters, I think you should expect some political response, and I think the Pope's received some of that.
It's not clear when a life and death war became just politics. But here we are in this moment for the church and state and war. I mean, since when are popes told they can't talk about war, they can't talk about peace, they can't talk about people who are dying and people who are living all around the world?
Since the beginning of the year of our Lord, popes have talked about peace, whether they were in war times, we were in war times, or peace times. Popes talk about peace. This Christmas, I will get dozens, if not more, of cards that say, peace on earth, goodwill towards men. I'm not really sure what is going on in this country, but we have a lot going on. And to say the Pope needs to be careful when he's discussing theology just makes no sense to me. It just really doesn't. The Pope is doing what popes do. And, you know, the president wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He talks about wars that he's stopped around the world. Isn't that about peace? So I'm not sure what we're doing.
Remember, he doesn't need the Nobel Peace Prize. He already got that prize from FIFA.
As a practicing Catholic, I know that the Vatican doesn't operate in our political paradigm. It's in the divine spiritual realm. So when the Pope sounds like the UN spokesperson saying no confrontation, no conflict, only peacekeeping, only diplomacy, that is totally normal. However, we learned this lesson with Pope Francis, who waded into politics probably more than any other pope before him, at least in terms of our modern politics. You do have to care about precision and exactitude as the successor to Peter, as someone who is informing the opinions of so many lay Catholics. So when you say, as the Pope, and I say this as a practicing Catholic, that God does not hear the prayers of those who wage war, that is a bit precarious and does risk confusing practicing Catholics, because does that mean the war to fight Hitler in World War II, was that unjustified?
All right, I've got to pause here for just a moment. I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic school, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be some expert on Catholicism. But everything I was taught growing up was that the Pope is infallible, that whatever the Pope says goes, that what the Pope says is the Word of God. I never heard anything different from that until Pope Francis came along. And then suddenly he starts saying things that right-wingers don't like, and now the rules change. Now it's like, well, if the Pope is standing on this side of the street, then it's the Word of God. But if he's standing on the other side of the street, then suddenly he's just some regular guy, and we don't have to listen to anything he says. And now it's gone to the point where, look, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but it's like, well, Pope Leo is speaking out against war. Yeah, but he said in the parking lot of the Sistine Chapel. You know what I mean? Like, if he's in that area, then suddenly he's just a regular mortal man, and it's all just opinion. They're making this up as they go along. And honestly, it's something that has driven me absolutely crazy. Let me know down in the comments, If you're Catholic, if you grew up Catholic, if you went to Catholic school, were you taught the same thing? That the Pope is infallible? Or were you told you could just pick and choose what to believe? Because I never, ever heard that growing up, not once until Pope Francis came along. But let's keep going.
The war against the Soviet Union, was that unjustified? I'm just saying that to say that he should be a little bit more precise, that's not like this.
Okay, but it's rather rich. It's rather rich for...
Before you jump in, Anna, there is actual clarity from the Catholic Church on this, to your point. And the Bishop James Massa, the Doctrine Committee Chair, so this is straight from the Catholic Church, says, a constant tenet of that 1,000-year tradition is a nation can only legitimately take up the sword in self-defense once all peace efforts have failed. That is, to be a just war, it must be a war of defense against another who actively wages war, which is what the Holy Father actually said. Quote, he does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war. So it continues, when Pope Leo speaks as supreme pastor of the Universal Church, he is not merely offering opinions on theology. He is preaching the gospel and exercising his ministry as the vicar of Christ. So he's basically saying, in fewer words, the Pope is teaching the gospel. He is speaking literally what the just war theory is. And I guess my question to you is, do you think that J.D. Vance knows more about Catholic theology than the Pope?
Well, like, I hear what you're saying about just war theory. That was created by St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. And what you're saying is that it has to be proportionate to the
I'm
actual
not saying
threat.
It, just to be clear.
No, that is what just war theory is. But it's also up to lay Catholics, according to the Vatican II Council, Second Vatican Council, to decide what that means for temporal matters. Just because the Pope makes some sort of dictate on political issues, that's not a religious proclamation.
I too am a Catholic, not a very flawed one. Granted, when I go to church, it should burst into flames. But here's what I know. In my lifetime, I've known no Pope that has more political involvement than John Paul II. He was part of a triumvirate with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in beating communism. He did things like show up in Cuba. He did things like show up in Nicaragua and confront the Sandinistas to their face. So popes have always been political. It comes with a job. I do think that the job of U.S. president and the job of pope are two completely different things, and each of them is speaking to their constituent. I think it's ridiculous that we're having like a rational conversation and debate here about theology, because the insane, decrepit, senile old man who's in the White House is posting pictures of himself, posing like Jesus, and attacking the Pope. This is, and I think it's rather rich and ridiculous and ironic for J.D. Vance, who is the vice president, to the president who is the least careful with words in my lifetime in this country, the man who celebrates death of Rob Reiner and Bob Mueller, the man who cusses on Easter Sunday. For now, J.D. Vance wants people to be careful with their words, or maybe he should tell the guy he works for.
Does she have a point about that? Why, first of all, why criticize the Pope and say, you better be careful with your discussion of theology and your use of words, when he doesn't care whether or not his own boss is careful with his words?
Yeah, I heard the vice president there. I actually think he had it backwards. I think that the Pope should be talking about theology. I respect the Pope's role in running the Catholic Church, and I also respect Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's role in American politics. That's their realm in which to be speaking their mind. And so I thought he had it backwards. It's interesting that you referenced Pope John Paul II and President Reagan. I was thinking about this this evening. There's a tremendous opportunity here for this Pope. If he would look at it this way: we're in the middle of a ceasefire. This blockade is working. There are no bombs falling. There's diplomacy going on right now. And there is a real chance, because of what Trump has done and the situation we find ourselves in, for the world to bring pressure, economic pressure, and diplomatic pressure, just like what was done in the 80s, to bear against this terrorist regime, just the way it was brought to bear against the Soviets in the 1980s. And so I get the feeling sometimes the Pope might be feeling a little adversarial, at least in some of his comments toward President Trump. I don't know that personally. It's my sense of it. But in this moment where you have, there's no bombs falling right now. There's a blockade. There's some restraint going on, and there's talks going on. This, to me, is a moment where you could have a partnership for peace in a way that brings this terrorist regime that, by the way, has been at war with the West for nearly 50 years to its knees. And I think just the way they brought the Soviets to their knees, it could happen right here.
Don't you think that opportunity goes both ways? In other words, it's also an opportunity for the President of the United States to cultivate an alliance with the leader of the Catholic Church and other foreign leaders, frankly, because what he's done by taking on the Pope is not just antagonize Catholics, he's antagonized people like his ally Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, where the Vatican is.
It's a fair It's
I mean,
a fair question. It's a fair question.
The Reagan, John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher thing was years of cultivation of relationships.
But this is a
in the
moment.
morning tweets.
But this is a moment.
It's irrational what he's doing, and you know it.
Well, it's not irrational to stand up to the Iranians.
It's irrational to be posting.
It's not irrational. But we're in a moment.
Pictures of himself.
We're in a moment.
Navarro, of course, is absolutely spot on with what she's saying here. Donald Trump is acting irrationally. He's acting immorally. And the Pope should be speaking out against him. And when it comes to what Abby Phillip read there, those are words that come directly from the Catholic Church itself. They make it clear that the Pope is absolutely correct in what he's doing. Because Scott Jennings can go on and on about 47 years and throw around talking points about Iran and terrorism all he wants, but none of that actually changes the core reality. Iran did not attack the United States. This was an offensive war initiated by Donald Trump and the United States of America. And no matter how much spin Scott Jennings tries to put on it, that fact does not change. This was not a defensive war. The Catholic Church's position is essentially this. If Iran had attacked the United States, that would be a completely different situation. But that's not what happened. The United States attacked Iran and ignited a war with Iran. So Scott Jennings can talk about peace all he wants. And sure, maybe peace will come at some point, but there is no peace right now. And that's because of the United States initiating strikes, bombing schools, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure. So the real question is, does Scott Jennings actually believe that the Pope would support something like that?
Is it rational to threaten a genocide of 90 million people? Is that rational, Scott? To threaten a genocide of 90 million people on Easter Sunday?
That didn't happen.
What do you think was meant by that?
You know what he's referring to.
And Scott Jennings is flat out lying there. That didn't happen. That did not happen. We all saw it. Not a tweet, but the Truth Social post and exactly what Donald Trump said. Scott Jennings is just lying on live TV in that moment. And of course, that's what he does. Misinformation, disinformation, twisting logic into pretzels, constant mental gymnastics. That's the entire Scott Jennings playbook.
I do.
And entire civilization.
Let me live.
Trump said, well,
let me live in reality today.
Let me just reiterate to the audience. The president said in a message that an entire civilization may die tonight.
On Easter Sunday.
He said that. So a lot of people read that as him threatening to wipe out an entire civilization. So the Pope, it does seem like the Pope would actually be rational to respond to that, and to say, hey, we shouldn't be in the business of war. And I think you're right that I'm sure the Pope is happy that there is a ceasefire, but he was responding to Trump waging a war. Does he not have a right to respond to that part of it too?
He has a right to say whatever he wants, but I would just say we're waging war against people who've been waging war against us for nearly 50 years. And look, the reality is, and the moment that we're in is special because we've got this regime on its knees economically, which has China. That's a problem for them as well. We've got a moment here where we can change something and change a situation that's been bad for tens of millions of people for going on 5 decades now. And I just, my hope, look, by the way, a lot of politicians in America disagree with the Pope. Do you guys agree with the Pope about abortion and gay marriage?
Well, let me say this.
The answer is no. And that's okay.
Hold on a
that's okay. It happens all the time.
But we all should agree with the Pope on
a lot of
peace.
people, not everybody's a Catholic. A lot of people disagree with
Donald
the Pope.
Trump's not a Catholic.
Hold on a second. A lot of people disagree with the Pope on a lot of doctrinal
issues. And he was not in line.
But hang on just a second. Before we go down that road, because we also know that Donald Trump supported abortion before he opposed it. But also,
he's been the most pro-life president we've ever had.
The response when you disagree with the Pope is very different from what Donald Trump did. What Trump said was, the Pope is weak on crime. The Pope,
that part.
He's insulting the man rather than just saying we have to
I agree with you.
Let's not whitewash what actually happened.
You don't measure the Pope by those political metrics.
But that's one of the most interesting things.
Hold on, Carolyn. I'm not understanding. I mean, I'm just saying Trump's response to his disagreement is not what anybody else's response is. Rather than just saying we disagree, the Pope is he's a figure of the church. I respect his opinion. We agree to disagree. He insulted the Pope. He attacked him repeatedly on social media. That is not.
Because that's exactly what Donald Trump does with everything. There's no room for disagreement with Donald Trump. You're expected to fall in line, to bow down to the so-called dear leader at all times, and there can never be any dissent.
What anybody else, frankly.
I agree with you that there was antagonism. But what I'm trying to also say is that they both fueled the fire. And if you look at what, no, well,
excuse me?
For
in what? So when did
to say that any war is unjustified, Abby? Do you really believe that?
Let me.
I don't.
For the
Most Americans wouldn't agree with that.
Let me just play.
Let
me play.
What prompted this war?
Just a second. Let me just play this.
Wait, what? 70% of Americans are against this war. So Scott Jennings is wrong there when he claims that most Americans would disagree with that. I'm going to stop here because this is already running pretty long, but you get the overall gist of what happened in this debate. If you want to watch the full thing, you can head over to CNN and check out the entire segment on Abby Phillip's show. But I just wanted to touch on something that they didn't fully get into here, especially when it comes to Catholics. Like the one woman on the panel saying she's a practicing Catholic. Because here's the thing. People who aren't Catholic can believe whatever they want and ignore what the Pope says. But if someone is a practicing Catholic, the way I always understood it, up until Pope Francis, was that whatever the Pope says goes. It wasn't the situation where you pick and choose or twist things into logic pretzels with mental gymnastics. But that's exactly what we keep seeing when it comes to Donald Trump. Everything turns into mental gymnastics. And Scott Jennings, along with the others who go on these shows, do the same thing when they're up against people like Ana Navarro and David Hogg, who, in my view, are simply presenting rational arguments and sticking to the facts. And then on the other side, it's just constant spinning and twisting of reality. But I want to hear from you. What do you think about all of this? Do you agree with what Ana Navarro and David Hogg had to say on Abby Phillip's show? Or do you find yourself siding with Scott Jennings? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more.